Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on how to make this strawberry quiet book. I am so happy you're here. I'm very excited to get into this project. I think this project is very easy. There are a lot of pieces, but I think it sews up really quickly. And I'm hoping this tutorial is pretty straightforward and really easy to follow. So let's get started. For materials, you are going to need felt, stiffened felt, a needle and thread, scissors, the printed pattern pieces. I have mine printed on freezer paper, which is optional. You can also print it on printer paper or cardstock. My personal preference is to batch cut, meaning that I cut all the pattern pieces out at once and then sort them by color. And then regardless of what page they're from, I cut them all out and then afterwards I sort them back into the correct pile. If you notice on the pattern pieces, I've included little symbols to represent which pages they belong to. So if you use these symbols, you can sort them after you cut and then keep everything nice and organized. All right, let's begin with the baking pages. So for each page, the first step will always be to work on the accessories first. So this would be the ingredients for the baking page, or for the doll page, it would be the accessories. So for the baking pages, we are going to begin with the eggs. So to start making the eggs, you're going to layer the yellow yolk piece on top of one of the white egg pieces. You're going to attach this using a whip stitch around the entire edge. So for each egg, you're going to layer a finished yolk piece, a stiffened egg piece in the center, and then the plain white back egg piece. So this I call the sandwiching technique, which is where you use two regular felt pieces with a stiffened felt piece on the inside. You're going to attach everything using a blanket stitch around the entire edge. And then you're going to repeat this for the second egg. For the flour and vanilla pieces, we're going to repeat this sandwiching technique. We're going to layer two flour pieces with a stiff flour piece in between, and then we're going to sew around the entire edge using a blanket stitch. I also wanted to note for the pattern pieces labeled vanilla, you can use these for many other ingredients. Other options would be baking powder, food coloring, any spice, oil, salt, water, even milk. You would just indicate what the ingredient is by the color that you choose. So repeat the sandwiching method for the cookie pieces. Layer two cookie layers with a stiff cookie layer on the inside. This makes 4 cookies total. Now for the small toppings that go on the cookies, instead of using the tiny pattern piece, I like to just use that as a visual guide. For the icing, you're going to sew the toppings to one of the icing layers. Once you've finished adding the details on top, you'll layer the icing with another icing layer on the back and then use a blanket stitch around the entire edge. For the icing pieces, there are no stiff pieces on the inside. Moving on to the spoon, sew on the spoon drip to one layer of the spoon using a whip stitch. The drip is only visible from one side so that you can flip the spoon from clean to dirty while playing. Sandwich method again, you're going to layer in this time 2 stiff spoon pieces inside. This just adds a little bit extra structure to the handle, and then you're going to sew around the entire edge with a blanket stitch. For the butter pieces, we are going to add some details. First, you're going to mark according to the pattern pieces along the dotted line. So I like to use a water erasable pen. You can use your preferred method. Then you're going to add on the details using either a back stitch or a running stitch, but visibly they both look the same. For embroidery details, I like to switch over to either embroidery floss, or I like to triple up my sewing thread that I'm using so that there are 6 threads total to make the embroidery really stand out. I also wanted to note for this butter front piece, you are going to stitch along the opening edge with a blanket stitch. So if you look at the pattern piece, this is indicated by the red dotted line, and this will be on other pattern pieces as well. This is just the edge that will get a lot of use, and I like to reinforce it with a stitch. For the piping bag, sew on the detail to the front using a whip stitch. I do repeat this for the back so it is double-sided. Use the sandwich method and use a blanket stitch along the entire edge of the piping bag. Moving on to the flour bag and jars, we are going to attach details. Now this, you're going to use a blanket stitch along the opening edge of the top and then a whip stitch to finish the detail along the bottom. And then for the jar, remember to add a blanket stitch along the top because that is an opening. This is also indicated on the pattern piece. For the cookie pocket, we are going to attach the scallop detail using a blanket stitch along the top and then a whip stitch along the scalloped bottom. For the oven door, we are going to attach the heart details using a whip stitch. Now, when sewing on the oven handle, you can look at the pattern piece as a guide, but you are going to use a whip stitch for the outer edges, and then you're going to blanket stitch along the center to create a handle pocket, which you can actually put your hand through. For the cookie tray, attach the front piece to the back using a whip stitch around the entire edge. For the left baking page, you're going to begin by aligning the countertop piece to the very bottom of the page. Then you're going to measure up 3¼ inches and add one of the top/middle shelves. And then you're going to go up 2 more inches and add the last top/middle shelf. And then it should be about 1¼ inch away from the top. Now, before you begin stitching along the bottom counter piece, you are going to insert the finished spoon and piping bag to create space for a pocket. And remember, you're going to do a blanket stitch along that edge, which it does show on the pattern piece. Connect the rest of the counter using a whip stitch. Connect the top and middle shelves using a whip stitch around the entire edge of these. These don't have any pockets. Then pin and sew the following pattern pieces in place: the bowl back, the egg carton back, and the butter back. Connect these using a whip stitch. For the details of these, remember to look on the pattern pieces as a guide and use a blanket stitch along the entire top edge of the bowl front. Use the same method, a blanket stitch along the top edge of the egg carton front, and then pin these in place. Remember to insert the ingredients. For the butter pocket, you're going to put the butter inside. For the eggs, you are going to put both eggs in. For the bowl, you're going to put in a couple of the flowers, maybe an egg, and then pin so there's space, and then sew along to attach using a whip stitch. You're going to repeat this exact same process for the flour bag and the jars, where you pin them, insert the ingredients, and then stitch along the edge. And then the left baking page is finished. To finish up the right baking page, you're going to pin the cookie pocket about 1¾ inch down from the top, and then 1 inch below that you will pin the cookie tray. To create the pocket for the cookies, insert the cookies and then pin and then sew using a whip stitch along the bottom and side edges. Place the oven door centered on top of the baking tray, about 1/4 inch up from the bottom, and then attach sewing only along the bottom edge using a whip stitch to create a door that you can open and close. And then there you have it. The left and the right pages are completely done. Well done. Set these aside until all the other pages are done. All right, let's begin on the doll pages. The first thing we're going to start with is the doll head. For the details of this, I like to take the pattern piece and use a thick needle and puncture through all the marks. And then I like to use my erasable marker and mark through the holes, and then that transfers it onto my doll head piece. You do have to go in and add the little round details to the eyes, but that's much easier to freehand once you have all the other things in place. And then we're going to embroider that. Same as before, I like to either use embroidery floss or I like to triple up my normal thread. You're going to either use a back stitch or a running stitch once again, and then I like to just fill in the entire eye circle. And then I like to use a little bit of red on the lips, but for the eyes and the nose, I'll usually either use black or dark brown. For the glasses, you're going to attach the front details using a whip stitch, and then you're going to use the sandwich method and layer the front and back glasses pieces with a stiff glasses piece inside. Connect this using a blanket stitch around the entire edge. For the clothing, we're going to start with attaching the collar piece to one top of the tank piece using a whip stitch. Then again, the sandwich method, layer the front and back pieces with a stiff layer inside using a blanket stitch around the entire edge. For the makeup accessories, we'll begin with the lipstick. Sew the lipstick bottom onto the top using a whip stitch. Repeat this for the other side so it is double-sided. Then layer with a stiff piece in between, blanket stitch around the entire edge. For the applicator, I like to fill with 2 stiff pieces, which is indicated on the pattern piece. This just adds a little bit more structure because it is kind of a small piece. Use a blanket stitch around the entire edge, and then repeat these steps with the brush. For the makeup palettes, begin by sewing on the hearts to the front of makeup lid A and makeup lid B using a whip stitch. Then you're going to use the third of the makeup lid A and makeup lid B as the back backs to the detailed pieces, stitch around the entire edge using a blanket stitch. For the pockets, you can use the pattern piece as a guide as to where to place the stars. Pin them and use a whip stitch around the edge, and then remember to blanket stitch along each top edge of the pockets for reinforcement. For the clothing that is attached to the page, attach the heart to one tank piece using a whip stitch. This is only one-sided because it's attached to the page, so there is no stiff piece and no back. For the hair, you're going to roll one doll hair piece and then sew along the length using a blanket stitch. Repeat this step for all 6 hair strands. Group 3 hair strands together and wrap one hair tie piece around and pin in place. Sew along the top and then down the seam to connect the hair ties, making sure that you pierce through each strand in the back so that it's fully connected to the hair tie. And then repeat this for the other 3 hair strands. All right, let's start attaching things to the pages. So for the left page, pin the doll head in place along with the star details. And then for the right page, pin makeup A and makeup B in place. For the pockets, we're going to use the same method as before where we insert the accessories. So the largest pocket beneath, you insert the clothing. For the smallest pocket, you insert the makeup accessories. For the medium pocket, you insert the sunglasses. Then attach the doll head and the stars using a whip stitch around all of the pieces. Attach makeup A and makeup B using a whip stitch around the entire edge. And then attach pockets using a whip stitch along the sides and the bottoms. Next step is to attach the doll hair to the head using a whip stitch and make sure you're penetrating through all the layers. Attach makeup lid A and makeup lid B on top of the coordinating makeups using a whip stitch. Now you're going to sew only along the top edge so that the flaps can open and close. You're going to attach the hair strands to the page using a whip stitch. So pin them in place, and then you're going to go through quite a few times to make sure that it is really on there because the hair is for braiding, so you want it to be very attached. And then the left and the right doll pages are both done. Congratulate yourself. You've put in a lot of hard work. They are looking really great. Now let's move on to the cover and the back pages. First step, I usually mark off 4 inches and then just keep that 2-inch section. We're going to align the letters vertically along the side panel so that I can place it evenly in the center. So you're going to pin them and then you're going to go around the edge with a whip stitch of each letter. Next step is to attach the flower center to the flower using a whip stitch. Then you're going to sew the details onto the strawberry using French knots. I like to just freehand this, make them even, make them look balanced. For the front page, I like to mark off 2 inches off the side and then just center everything to the 6-inch section on the right side. So I like to center the strawberry top, and the flower. Then you're going to pin and attach using a whip stitch with coordinating thread colors. For the back page, I like to cover 2 of the inches and then just center everything on the left 6 inches. So I place the heart evenly and then I attach them using a whip stitch. Now we are going to start assembling our pages. So remember, inside each page is a stiff layer. So for the first page, we are going to assemble the strawberry front page, then a stiff layer, then the left baking page. Now my suggestion is you pin all the pages in place, lay them out, and then go through them to make sure everything is correct. The second set of pages is going to be the right baking page, and then a stiff layer, and then the left doll page. And then the last set is going to be the back cover page with the hearts, a stiff layer, and then the right doll page. So pin these all, lay them all out on top of each other, open it, flip it through like a book, make sure they are all correct. Once that is done, you can sew around each page using a blanket stitch. All right, we are almost done. Next, we are going to attach the binding. Lay your back page and your front page exactly 2 inches apart. Now, measure this a few times to get it right. Then you're going to mark the center of the inside binding, and then you're going to pin in place. You're going to sew along the vertical lines of the binding using a whip stitch, connecting to the front cover. Make sure you are not going all the way through on this step. You are just connecting it to the front cover page. Do this along the front and the back cover on the vertical lines only. Leave the top and the bottom seams open. We will get to these later. Once this is done, you're going to flip it over and then you're going to pin the pages down to the binding. So everything should be in place. You are really just doing a second seam to attach the inside pages. And you're going to do this using a whip stitch. I like to use the pre-existing stitches as a guide and then just sew the new seam directly on top. For this section, you can pierce all the way through. As you can see my stitches on the back side, this will add durability, and then this layer will also be covered by the outside binding in a later step. Next, you're going to mark the center line of that inside attached binding. Again, I like to use an erasable marker. You're going to pin the middle page in place. So I like to pin it and then sort of flip it and make sure it's really looking even between the two pages. Then you're going to sew along the vertical line, again using a whip stitch. This time you again are going to go through all the layers because the outside binding will cover this. All right, next step, you're going to pin the stiff binding layer piece on top of the inside binding. So as you can see, the stiff is going to get pinned slightly on the inside. You do not want it sticking out. It is made to fit centered in between. Sometimes it's easier to fold it over and pin to make sure it's really going to lay flat. And then you're going to attach the stiff binding layer using a whip stitch. Do not pierce all the way through on this layer. Only attach it to the inside binding. Again, we're only going up the vertical lines. We are not attaching top and the bottom seams quite yet. All right, we are on to our last step. You're going to take the outside binding, the one with the name, and pin it to the existing binding. So this should slightly overlap the edges. This is the largest one. It should encase everything so you cannot see the stiff layer or the underneath layer. This one might take a little bit of pinching and tugging. You want to pin it really straight on the front where the name is, and then pull it around to the back and really make sure it's laying nicely. Sew up the vertical lines of the binding using a whip stitch, making sure not to go through all the layers, just attaching to the front page. Now we are going to continue around the top and bottom edges, encasing everything. Now everything should lay nice and flat. And now look, you are done. You have made an entire quiet book that will hopefully last for years and years. Hopefully this was fun to make. You can do this in any color, any name, customize it however you want. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. This has been really fun. I really hope you enjoy this pattern. I put a lot of love into it. So happy holidays, everyone, and thank you so much for watching.